mic around. Good afternoon, and welcome to this public hearing on the refugee crisis. I'm Gordon Schultz, and I'll be the moderator for today's hearing. There are some acknowledgments I'd like to make, but because we're running a little bit behind, I'll ask you to turn to the back page of your program. Thank you. I almost said bulletin. Back page of, showing my pedigree. On the back page of your program, there are the people that we would like very much to be acknowledged. 2 years ago, a crisis that had been brewing since the 60s and 70s and probably earlier began to boil over in Central America. Tens of thousands of people, mostly children under 15, to avoid decapitation and death by torture, left their homes on a harrowing journey through jungle and desert, trying to avoid human slavers who would capture the children through agricultural, domestic, and sexual slavery. At the same time, we have watched in horror as people risk their lives and the lives of their children to flee from their homes. Tens of thousands have died in the perilous sea and mountain crossings, many of them small children. As they fled northward, Europe was thrown into crisis. While the numbers were small compared to the numbers of refugees successfully resettled after World War II, nativist and neo-Nazi type movements saw this mass migration as an opportunity to stoke fear and gain political power. This has led to perhaps the greatest number of neo-fascists since World War II moving into parliaments and political offices all across Europe. We as Americans have been here before. When Adolf Hitler came to power, it became widely known that the Nazi movement was determined to eliminate Jews not only from Germany and from Europe, but also the world. As Jews were rounded up, their possessions taken away, as they were forcibly removed from their homes, neighborhoods, and workplaces, the United States looked on and did nothing. When they were packed into train cattle cars and delivered to forced labor and extermination camps, the United States looked on and did nothing. When the SS St. Louis, a ship of almost 1,000 Jews, pleaded for entry into the United States in 1938, they were forbidden entry. The ship was turned around and steamed back to Germany, where many died in Nazi concentration camps. Why were they turned back? Why were other Jewish refugees prevented from even trying to come to the United States, even though U.S. officials knew that any Jew left in Europe was subject to murder on a scale never before seen in all of human history? Historians identify three primary reasons. One, the U.S. is coming out of the Great Depression, and refugees seemed a threat to the jobs that people had not had and now were beginning to get. Two, the U.S. government, especially the White House and the State Department, were convinced that refugees were a threat to national security. The fear at the highest levels of government was that Nazis would infiltrate the refugees and gain entry to a defenseless America, and that the Jews themselves would be spies for the Nazis and thus could not be trusted. And finally, undergirding the other two reasons, anti-Semitism was strong and widespread, especially in government and especially in the FBI and State Department. The argument that shaped our policies then toward Jewish refugees was, they are dangerous. We don't know who they are. This is a Christian country, and if you let in thousands of Jews, the character of the nation would change forever. Now in 2016, we are hearing those same arguments, once directed at Jews, now directed at Muslims and Mexicans. Not since World War II, with a few exceptions, has there been such fear and hostility toward refugees fleeing persecution, torture, and death. In fact, one presidential candidate has made opposition to refugees, especially to Muslims and Central Americans, the centerpiece of his campaign. Today we're going to address some of the deepest fears that Americans have about refugees. One, that we don't know who they are, and we have no way of determining who is safe and who is not. Therefore, they as a group are a threat to national security. Two, refugees don't assimilate. and become truly American, and are a drain on our tax dollars, even while they steal our jobs. And 3, we are a white Christian civilization. If we let in black, brown, or yellow people with unacceptable religious beliefs, we will lose our country that we love. Now let me explain the process for our hearing. First, our 3 witnesses will give their testimony to this assembly. Then we'll ask the ecumenical interfaith panel to ask questions of our experts, and then we will open up the conversation to the floor, and you simply come to the mic and ask your question or make your statement. Our first speaker is Lisa Ann Brenan. Ms. Brenan oversees the Services for New Americans program at Ascentria Care Alliance in Worcester, Massachusetts, the largest refugee resettlement program in Central Mass. Ascentria offers services to over 1,000 refugees and immigrants from 30 countries around the world each year. Ms. Brenan has degrees in public health, theology, and social policy, as well as being a member of the Governor's Advisory Council on Refugees and Immigrants. Ms. Brenan will give testimony regarding the process of vetting applicants for refugee and asylum status. She will address this question: is it safe to allow refugees into the United States? How do we know? Lisa?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. Can you hear me without this? That's better. Terrific, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for taking some time out this afternoon, on a gorgeous afternoon, to come and have some of these courageous conversations that communities need to have. I work for Ascentria Care Alliance, and as was mentioned, we do the work of refugee resettlement, and so we face the question every single day, is it safe? And we have to go to bed at night, all 35 of my staff and myself, and we have to have some resolution to that question for ourselves. So I hope by the time I finish talking about the process itself of resettlement, you'll have more information and you'll have a better sense within yourself of how to answer that question. So the refugee resettlement process starts a long, long and far place away from where we sit now. Many refugees spend between 2 and 4 years in the process of resettlement. And less than 0.5% of all refugees around the world ever make it to a third country for resettlement. So it's a very small portion of people who actually make it through the resettlement process simply because of the volume of numbers. You may have heard this past week, World Refugee Day, where we remember the courage, strength, and determination of refugees around the world. UNHCR came out with a report that updated the stats, and we know that there are 59.5 million people who are displaced forcibly from their homes at this very moment. 122 people every minute is displaced. Of those, millions more are refugees. And we're going to talk a little bit about what is the difference, who is a refugee, and what does that mean to be a refugee. When conflict arises, and we're seeing growing numbers of conflicts that are entrenched and very powerfully uprooting people from their cities, from their countries, when those conflicts arise and people reach the point where they will feel safer with nothing at all, starting a new beginning, than staying in their home, that's when they decide to become someone who is fleeing, and their status then becomes a refugee. When you are fleeing your home country because of a well-founded fear of persecution or death, because of your association with a particular political group, social group, or other association, that is when you become a refugee. We also work at Ascentria with asylees, victims of torture and human trafficking. and unaccompanied refugee children. But for the sake of this conversation today, I'm going to focus my remarks on the refugee. When someone flees, either as an individual or as a family, and many refugees flee as families, they go to the first place of rest and refuge, and that is typically within or just over the country or region from which they're fleeing. So that host country, that very first place where people land, is often a place where people will gather and develop, many places around the world, very informal settlements where you can languish for many years, many decades even, in this informal settlement that does not recognize as a citizen the new arrivals. The next option is that there will be a location where there is an overseas processing center. At those centers where trained people from the Department of State and from the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, sends trained personnel to set up processing facilities. Those are typically located within a refugee camp. And within those camps, so people have a choice. They have the option of staying within their first place of refuge or moving on to a refugee processing center or a refugee camp. I'm going to save my comments and some context around the refugee camp option for people for later if we have time for that. So I want to, but that is of itself a fascinating dilemma for any person or family to have to choose between. So beginning at that overseas processing center, families and individuals will fill out essentially an application to become a refugee, to enter into that process. And that application is then taken and reviewed and considered and verified. The facts are verified to the extent possible. Staff members actually go out into the areas of conflict to confirm facts and political situations. Those applications, once reviewed and approved, are given a particular status where they can move on further into the process. The next step is typically for people to undergo medical screening and further interviews. That medical screening and those interviews, once they pass, will then allow them to continue to move along in the process, where they then go through screening that includes verifying their names with our FBI databases, our Department of State databases, and other security checkpoints, both between countries and within the United States. So I'm just going to say here that if anyone, and I talk about this a lot when I meet with groups, if anyone wants to come into our country to carry out terrorist acts, this is a highly inefficient way to do that. And as you'll see, I'm going to continue on in this process of becoming a refugee and arriving in the United States, but it is extraordinarily inefficient. So typically it can take 15 months to a year or to 2 years to go through this initial phase of screening and interviewing. By this time, there is the national network of voluntary organizations, of which I work with one, that's the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, LIRS, becomes the contracted agent, if you will, of the federal government to manage the domestic side of the resettlement process. So people who are going through the application process and have been through the first phase, and they've passed the screenings, and they've passed the medical exams, and they've passed the psychological exams, and they've gone through orientation and training about what it will be like when they come to the United States. The security screenings, just in case there's new information, so they go through the screenings again, just for one last check, essentially, before people depart their processing center or the refugee camp. Once people arrive, they are again checked at one of our designated airports for verification that they are indeed who we approved to come into the United States. And I just want to say too, if people aren't aware, that every single year our government, our Congress, and then it's approved by our president, invite and sanction and welcome between 60 and 75,000 refugees each year. So that is something, a system internally within our country that we have set up, because we've said this is part of who we are as a nation. This is part of our national identity, that we welcome people who are in such dire circumstances that without our assistance, they may perish. So within our country, there is a system set up for which we manage the arrival of these 75,000 people each year. My organization is one of many across the country who is then contracted to provide services to every single refugee arrival that comes within our program. Within Worcester, which is, I think, the closest resettlement program to where we sit here in Hopkinton, we resettle probably 270 to 300 refugees each year. In addition, we also receive about 80 unaccompanied refugee children. Our legal department works with about 900 people each year who are looking to adjust their legal status. And we also work with a number of people who have been certified victims of trafficking and torture. So within that process, we then welcome the new refugee. Our organization, like many resettlement agencies, is responsible for identifying housing, and we do that through the open housing market, just like anyone else moving here. We have caseworkers who have relationships with landlords and will secure an apartment. We will furnish it with very basic, modest household furnishings, and we will have someone who speaks the person's home language with us when we pick this new family up at the airport. And from there, the process of the domestic resettlement begins. We work with people very intensively for the first 3 to 4 to 5 months until they are able to manage and navigate their new home on their own. That's sort of a fallacy, because I don't think any of us, including refugees, ever navigate our own worlds on our own. We always have friends, and we have families, and we have church congregations, and we have people of faith around us who help us every single day. And that's an important link that even refugees need, and refugees especially need that link. They need to have those social connections, because our organization, our case managers, can't do that kind of social connectedness. We can make sure that people are safe. We can make sure that people have food. We can make sure that they have housing. We can make sure that they're registered for public benefits until they learn enough English where they can get a job and begin to earn their own income. And we can talk more about that process in just a minute. But we can do all the technical assistance. But the social and spiritual connectedness is where we are we don't have the capacity to do that, which is why we work very closely with the community. So that process of resettlement starts the moment we pick a family up at the airport, and we have some established services already set for them when they arrive. And I'm very open about this when I talk about the process in public, because I think it's important for people to understand that the moment, well, not the moment, we allow people to catch up on their sleep and, you know, have a couple days of rest and learn where they are and meet their caseworkers. But very shortly after that, we enroll every refugee in public assistance. And we do that for a reason, because very shortly they're going to be on their own to pay their rent and they're going to have bills to pay. But what we do simultaneously is we assess English language skills, because we know that full integration, successful integration, is very much dependent on someone's ability to listen, to speak, to write, and to understand English, and to understand how to use English in the workplace. So we assess people's English skills, and on site we have English classes. And we also have a network of ESL classes within the city that we can refer to, depending on people's levels. We have 3 levels of English classes, and in addition we have computer literacy, math literacy, and we have a pre-literacy class, which we're seeing, we're seeing people who are arriving who've never had formal education. So their challenges have just multiplied. So we've developed recently, in the last couple of years, a class that will help people to learn to read and write in English, but also it will help them in their own language as well. We have a team of employment specialists, and we have a network of employers, of 200 plus employers, with whom we have a relationship, and they understand the value and the determination and the loyalty of refugee employees. And we, at times, will have more jobs available, more jobs open than we can fill. Refugees are not taking our jobs. I just need to be clear about that. Refugees are taking jobs that they are eligible for, as is anyone else. Companies come to me, I must have companies call me, and I'm talking large national and multinational companies approach me on a monthly basis saying, we can't fill our jobs, can you help us? If we don't have a stronger workforce, we are going to have to close our doors. It's astonishing to me. And so we've begun working with employers. I don't want to get too far afield here, but I think the employment issue is critical for understanding how the integration process works. We are beginning to talk with employers about how to become more culturally and linguistically capable of working with refugee clients and immigrant clients. So they're realizing that it is a two-way learning process, a two-way street, if you will, for having a community that can welcome successfully newcomers. So the process is that the stronger and more stable a family becomes within learning their English skills and becoming employed, they have learned how to generate their own income. The reliance on public assistance proportionately goes down until a time when people are what we call self-sufficient. And that is true, just strictly an economic term, if you will. It's being able to pay your bills and to navigate within your town and within your community. So that is essentially the process that people go through to arrive here and to become integrated into the community. And that might be a good stopping place. If there's anything that I haven't covered, feel free to let me know.
We'll go to Westy, and then we'll give you the opportunity and our panel the opportunity to fire questions at any or all three. Our second witness is Professor Westy Egmont of Boston College School of Social Work, president of the International Institute of Boston and New Hampshire, and for 11 years, a commentator for WBZ TV. Professor Egmont is an expert on the process of assimilation of refugees into the United States and their impact on the U.S. economy and society. With a doctorate in pastoral counseling, Dr. Egmont has focused on the human needs and social services of newcomer communities, immigrant rights, and the complex two-way process of immigrant integration. Dr. Egmont has served as an advisor to 6 governors and is the co-chair of the Governor's Advisory Council on Immigrants and Refugees. Dr. Egmont.
Gordon, thanks. And my thanks to you. What an exceptional group of people who on one of New England's 2 days of summer have chosen to be here to enjoy each other and to talk about something of conscience. A very unusual and wonderful group of people, I'm sure, for the choices you are making and what you represent by thoughtfulness. So thanks for the honor of being with you to think about something which is redefining our nation and obviously redefining our world. What a historic week. A remarkable moment where we watch the underlying commentary predominating in the United Kingdom that immigration was the primary issue that people were reacting to in their assessment of whether or not their country was okay as it is in the EU or needed to step outside. This to me is a very telling story. It may not be the only reason. Certainly sociological change is gigantic and affects every one of us, and as we think about our own comforts in the world, diversity has become pretty normative, but not everybody has accepted that new norm. So we find ourselves in a world that's changing and a world that we are all reacting to, and sometimes we see ourselves as agents of that change and sometimes we see ourselves as the resistors. I would suggest this week in history will be substantive. I'm not sure that any of us are smart enough to know the outcome of this exit vote, but I would suggest that at least for the next couple of years we'll watch every right-wing group of Europe, see whether or not they could test the question again for themselves and move against the acceptance of asylees, refugees, and economic migrants who are coming to Europe, coming into their countries. One of the things that is amazing to me is how precarious the incredible genius and wonder of America is. And what's happened in the UK this week should cause us all to step back and become protective of our country. The genius of America, if it is anything, is that we have come together to form this imperfect union. We, the people, says our Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union, hardly a perfect union, but in the effort, have come together. And that we has been constantly evolving from the day it was written to today. We have been struggling whether it meant landed white men, or men and women, or men, women, and those not white, to have voice, vote, participation in the political processes. We've yet to have a woman president after all these years. We've finally seen someone of color in the White House. But we are ever evolving in the question of what it means to become a country that's really inclusive and empowering of all people equally. Well, at the heart of this, the question is a sense of who the we is, how that we evolves, how we take in people and who we should take in. And I would suggest that it's going to be in very high drama again, if it hasn't already been. We have struggled with this recently by the waves of the young people coming from Central America. The UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, defines those young adults coming across the border, the average being a 14-year-old girl, by the way, coming across the border from Central America as refugees. The United States sees them as criminals. We turn them back. We have made a corporate decision that they are unwelcome. We have what are called baby jails along the border as a way of containing the population that comes. Those who have family are put under the care of the family, but they are immediately put into deportation proceedings. We struggle with the question of who is the we? Who should we allow in? Do we want to have an open border? Absolutely not. Chaos would ensue. Do we want to have a controlled border? Absolutely. But who is the we? Who are we going to let in? What are our priorities? How do we define that as a country? And I don't think there's any consensus. But I would suggest to you as a point conscience, and especially in such a heavily religious conversation as seems to be a part of the expert here at the table. We are people who, first of all, should be aware of the humanitarian crises of the world and should have a humanitarian admission policy that's generous, that's inclusive, that is as open as we can try to afford to be. So we've done that in a couple of ways. One of the most remarkable ways we've done it, and by the way, it was George Washington in the first inaugural address in our country who said that his hope for this new country is that it would be an asylum for mankind. So we carry on a long tradition. There's nothing new here. But it took till 1980 to create the U.S. Refugee Act under Ronald Reagan. It's been a strong Republican tradition of the country to include immigrant labor and to include others who needed the country's safety, its provisions of refuge. And since 1980, we have seen this refugee program go through a few iterations, but it has evolved and emerged as a dynamic, wonderful program in our country. 3 million people have now come to the United States, almost all of them alive today, as refugees since 1980. Now, I think we should be applauding our country. We should applaud ourselves. This is not because we're smart or wonderful or incredibly humanitarian, but in a little bit of all of those things at work have meant that our body politic, our civic life, has said that we can be inclusive enough to make that much room for people. That 10% of our admissions, approximately 10% of those we allow to come into the United States, would be humanitarian admissions. In Europe, that's predominantly asylees. In the United States, it's predominantly refugees. We haven't figured out how to deal with those across the southern border and give them classifications that allow them to be a part of us with legal status. And I would suggest, though, that the young people from Central America, Honduras is the homicide capital of the world, should be given just as much refuge as should somebody fleeing the Congo across into Italy. But in the practicality, this U.S. refugee program has been our way of organizing our efforts. It's been our way of saying it's possible for us as a country to be inclusive of those who need to be here, as well as those who come for economic purposes. They are very seldom people who actually get to choose that this is their first country. They may list that, they may have a relative or someone they know and get to be here, but most of them are simply grateful to go to a country that abides under the rule of law because their country has collapsed. When you consider that as we sit here, the other great historic event is, according to the UNHCR this week, we have reached an all-time high in refugees at this moment. Now, is the world more civilized? Have we become people of greater prosperity and wealth and human awareness? I would suggest to you with numbers like 60 million people who do not have the defense of a government and find themselves stateless, whether they are in the border or have crossed the border, that this 60 million people represents a crisis of global proportion. And every one of us has some obligation to think about our role. Now, no one country can take them all, so again, the principle has to be, well, who should take them? The answer is everyone. Right? We all need to stand as nations and as individuals, shoulder to shoulder, to receive those who need to come. We agreed back in 1948, in the foundations of the United Nations, that we would have a document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 13 says that we have the right to migrate. We have the right to leave our country of origin, to find safety across a border where we are able to pursue for ourselves our well-being, or the right to return. Unfortunately, there's a giant but in that, because the Declaration gives us the right to leave to pursue our safety and welfare, but it doesn't require of any other country abutting us that they would take us in. So the sovereign nations don't necessarily have to say, well, welcome, you may want to flee, but that doesn't mean you can come. Now, as we wrestle with this issue in the United States, I would pause to say that countries like Germany, I hope Merkel, for all the controversy, gets a Nobel Prize. She has stood up in Europe in the most remarkable way, with originally some room for 400,000, now 1 million people abiding in her country. It is an amazing, bold act of political leadership. We're seeing some of its repercussions, but it's needed. It was warranted economically for the country, which was growing and prospering and needed labor, and it was warranted from a historic perspective of a country that had created refugees and now was receiving refugees. I'd say it's true of other countries, whether they recognize it or not, and it's true of the United States. I don't think we have to step up and feel embarrassed, however, as Americans, because of the strength of our program. With 3 million people already received, and with a robust program of receiving some 70 to 80,000 people a year, we are in a good place. The President's taken us up an extra 15,000 to 85,000 next year. We had, at the height of the Vietnamese boat people, over 200,000 people arrive. We have capacity for more, and I would suggest that in every state, if we did like in Massachusetts, with some 2,500 people arriving a year, that we wouldn't even see it. We wouldn't feel it. We wouldn't know it was happening. I adopted one of the lost boys of the Sudan in the sense of making him part of my life. Those young men have all prospered. They're going to college. They are doing fabulously with their families. They are one of the hundreds of success stories of the individual populations of refugees who've come. If you know the Bosnians who came, I doubt you would have a moment's pause about having them as a neighbor. They would be the people you'd be proud to call a friend. Though, yes, they may have had a Muslim background, or they may have been Christian, they may have been Orthodox, but they have come easily and gently and graciously into our country. The Somalis and others who deal with the issues of minority status, of race, religion, and language, have a harder road, right? Because America's other prejudices come to the fore, but not because they're refugees. The problem they face is the fact that America has a long history of bigotry. And we express both our xenophobia at moments and our racial prejudice in many, many moments. It is a much harder thing for refugees of such significant minority statuses, multiple minority identity statuses, to quickly and easily become a part of our country. But this incredible country does well because of organizations like Lutheran Social Services, Ascentria, or the International Institute, or HIAS, or IRC, or any of the 10 agencies that do the resettlement. These folks have found their way in, and in 8 months, by and large, they're economically self-sufficient and are contributing to the economic welfare of the country as tax-paying employees, working and supporting themselves, contributing to their community, and trying hard to integrate into their local community. Now, integration is, unfortunately, not something that we should assume happens easily. It is not an automatic thing. I created at Boston College the Immigrant Integration Lab because there was no place in the country I could find that was addressing the question of social cohesion as a part of refugee immigrant work. And we really needed to stop and think about the fact that a lot of what isn't happening in France and a lot of what isn't happening in England is the integration. And when you look at the neighborhood of Moosberg in Brussels, where a lot of the ferment was taking place, or in Saint-Denis or Aubervilliers on the northern parts of Paris, you see large populations of unemployed young adults. If you get 35% unemployed young men who are eager to work, who came with the hope of a good new life, but who are kept marginalized, then their hope and their promise is denied, and the society is at risk. So it's at that point that we have to take an extra obligation. We have to assume as good citizens that the receiving community has to do as much work as the arriving community. The receiving community is morally obligated to figure out what the pathways are for social inclusion, economic inclusion, political inclusion, civic inclusion, neighborhood inclusion. I love the Norwegian Queen who has an annual event called Have Tea with an Immigrant Day. Sometimes it's not very profound activity. You know, when I started doing this work down in the South Shore, and I realized I was busy shooting off my mouth at all kinds of public places, but I had 5 new houses that had been built across the street from me. I'd never invited those people to my house, so I had a little open house on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, had all my new neighbors come over. I was shocked to discover an Egyptian dentist and a hygienist who was from Cambodia, as well as an Irish fireman, all living a neighbor's of mine. I didn't know any of them until I made the effort. This is the nature of suburbs. I now live downtown Boston. I'm much more comfortable in my diversity in that environment. But we have to work incredibly hard to build the bridges. And so we may take time on Sunday afternoon to come, but I would suggest if we haven't taken time to figure out how to share our home, how to make room in our life to include someone, then this is a theoretical conversation. We have to become the agents of integration, every one of us. And as that happens by one and one and one, then the miracle of the United States dream comes real, for us as well as for the newcomer. because that sense of economic prosperity where we, the people, emerge as a prospering, economically vital people is realized. So I want to encourage you today to acknowledge the huge nature of history this week, to participate in not letting the United States be the United Kingdom, to think together about how we as individuals are agents of integration, how our houses of worship, our schools, our hospitals, our social service agencies intentionally reach out to others to include them and provide for them a pathway into us, and then as part of us, a pathway into our personal lives as well as into our community life. When that happens, I think something exciting happens for every one of us. And I'm a big believer in the American dream because it worked for my family, it works for other families, and I suspect it's going to work for the refugees that continue to come in today's flow.
Thank you. Our next witness is Mr. Jeff Jacoby. Mr. Jacoby has been an op-ed columnist at the Boston Globe since 1994, and before that was the chief editorial writer for the Boston Herald. Mr. Jacoby is an honors graduate at the George Washington University and Boston University School of Law. Before becoming a columnist, Mr. Jacoby worked briefly as an attorney and then as the deputy manager of Ray Shamey's campaign for the United States Senate. His journalistic awards are significant. They include the 1999 Grindel Prize, the 2004 Thomas Paine Award, and the 2009 Ben Hecht Award for Outstanding Journalism on the Middle East. Mr. Jacoby is nationally recognized as an important conservative and libertarian voice in American journalism.
If it's okay with you, I need to stand because I've got this big post in the way and I want to be able to look everybody in the eye and see who I'm talking to. Nothing worse than going to Fenway Park and having the worst sight line, right? Besides, why shouldn't the people up the front get to stretch a little and twist around? I'm thrilled to be here. I just love looking at this picture. The picture that this group makes as I was sitting here listening to my eloquent colleagues and looking forward to the conversation. I kept thinking about that famous picture by Norman Rockwell. One of the four, he has the series of the four freedoms, and one of them is freedom of speech. And there's that picture of a town meeting or a public hearing or whatever the scene is supposed to be, where there's a group of citizens who look all different and clearly come from different backgrounds, and they're all very animated and engaged and interested in something, and somebody's speaking, and it's just a beautiful picture of America. When this subject, as the subject engages so many of us, there's a temptation to sometimes, I'm going to do it too in a moment, to beat up on our country and to beat up on our society and to beat up on ourselves for our failings. It's worth remembering, though, that even at our worst, even when pieces and parts of us are showing some of the most unpleasant aspects of what can happen in America, we are in so many ways miles and miles ahead of what so many people in the world are forced to confront. So it's worth remembering, while it's good to goad ourselves to do better, let's not forget just what it is that we do accomplish. I was asked to talk about some of the moral aspects of this question of Syrian refugees and the refugee crisis. You've already heard my panelists, my co-panelists and Reverend Schultz talk about some of this, and I'm not sure that there's anything that I can say that will really add an insight that nobody here is unable to think of for themselves. But I'd like to make three broad points, some of which will overlap with a little bit of what's going on. As you've heard, we are now in the midst of the worst refugee crisis since World War II. My apologies for walking in late. I got tangled at a toll booth. But as I was walking in, I heard Reverend Schultz talking about the SS St. Louis. Well, since World War II, we are now in a world refugee crisis that is unprecedented. Somebody just mentioned, I think Professor Egmont mentioned the latest figures from the UNHCR. More than 65 staggering tidal of misery, of grief, and of sorrow. The UN estimates, I heard you give a per minute number. I was all of Hopkinton? 34,000 people a day. By far the greatest number come from just a few countries. Sudan, Somalia, Afghanistan, and these days, above all, Syria. The Syrian civil war, as you've heard, has uprooted something like 11 million people. Almost 5 million have left the country. And although there has been massive coverage, I agree with what Professor Egmont said about Angela Merkel, there's been massive coverage of the effect and the influx of Syrian refugees into Europe. Nevertheless, the overwhelming majority of displaced Syrian refugees are still in the Middle East. Something like 4.9 million of them are in the countries that border Syria and the area, especially Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And only a tiny, 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 tiny trickle, it's like the opposite of Bernie Sanders, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1% have managed or have even contemplated making their way to the United States. One of the American Foreign Service's most distinguished members, Ryan Crocker, who has been an ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Syria, to Iraq, to Lebanon, to Afghanistan, to Pakistan. He has called, as a bipartisan group in Washington did over the past few months, he has called for the United States to admit 100,000 refugees from Syria. As you know, the Obama administration has committed itself to admitting just 10,000. And as of last month, maybe the numbers are slightly higher, but I checked the numbers as of the end of May, a grand total of 2,235 had been allowed to enter. 11 million displaced, 2,235 have been allowed to enter the United States. So point number one, it's an enormous crisis, and the United States cannot be said to be doing its part. Point number two, we do have, as you've heard, a history of offering refuge on moral grounds, on ethical grounds, on grounds of decency and humanity to suffering people and to people fleeing persecution throughout our history. It is integral to the American national story. Everybody knows the poem by Emma Lazarus that's engraved on the base of the Statue of Liberty. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. When she wrote that poem, that also was a controversial idea. Nevertheless, it made its way onto the base of that statue. It continues to resonate. It's part, you might say, of America's civil religion. This idea of welcoming immigrants and accepting the homeless tempest-tossed. Long before there was a country called the United States, America was a haven for people who needed one. Late every fall, we celebrate, we commemorate a group of tempest-tossed refugees who arrived in Massachusetts in 1621. Weren't the Pilgrims on the Mayflower refugees? They were fleeing from, or they had fled from, a theocratic regime that insisted on submission to an established order and that could be merciless and violent in its treatment of nonconformists. Cruelty and blood is in our streets. The land aboundeth with murders, slaughters, and whatsoever is evil. That's not a dispatch from Aleppo or from Homs last week. That's the English Puritan leader Robert Rice writing to John Winthrop about what the Puritans, what the separatists were dealing with in England. John Winthrop would later go on to become the founder of what today we call Boston. America has long thought of itself, not just as a nation of immigrants, but specifically as a nation that welcomes refugees. And yet, while that's true, and mindful of what I said a minute ago about not beating up on ourselves too much, the story has never been that simple. It's true that the United States has made room for tens of millions of refugees over the years. And I would argue that we became the world's preeminent superpower in part because of, or maybe primarily because of, the economic and the cultural and the scientific and the innovative blessings that those refugees brought with them. you look at the list of American Nobel Prize winners, 9 out of 10 names are the names of if not immigrants, then the children or the grandchildren of immigrants. When we, at our best, open our borders, open our doors, open the gates, and welcome people who need a refuge, we, in the long run, are the great gainers by it. The United States is the great gainer by it. But the unhappy truth is that America's welcome has rarely been as open-armed as we like to think when we look back. In the 1930s and the 1940s, Reverend Schultz was talking before about how many Americans opposed allowing refugees, especially Jewish refugees, from Nazi Germany to enter the United States. When Gallup, the Gallup poll, asked in 1939 whether it would be acceptable for 10,000 children, not adults, not working people, 10,000 young children, to be brought into the United States as refugees from Germany, quote, to be taken care of in American homes, not to be put on welfare, not to be on public assistance, but to be taken into American homes that were prepared to accept them, 2/3 of the public said no. Some politicians, including FDR, President Roosevelt, as you heard, warned that refugees from Germany might be Nazi agents in disguise. When one of Roosevelt's advisors was asked how there could be opposition to allowing children to come in, the answer was, nits become lice. Let them in when they're just little nits, and they'll grow up to become lice. And as I was walking in, I heard him mention the infamous story of the St. Louis 937 Jewish refugees from Hitler's Germany refused entry into any of the ports that they went to in the Western Hemisphere. They started in Cuba, weren't allowed in. They went to the United States, weren't allowed in. Tried Canada, weren't allowed in. Were sent back. Many of the people on board died in the Holocaust. For all our pride in our immigrant roots, and we deserve to be proud of those roots, we should be proud of those roots, we should be inspired by those roots. At the same time, anti-refugee sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment has always been strong here as well. In 1956, I grew up in Cleveland. Cleveland has a very large Hungarian population. So the history of Hungary and modern Hungary is one that you don't tend to hear about it so much in New England, where I come from, where the people have names like Kucinich and Voinovich and good Eastern European names. You hear a lot about Hungary. Cleveland once had 6 Hungarian-language daily newspapers. That's how strong the history of Hungary is in connection to Cleveland. In 1956, some of you will remember learning about the Hungarian Revolution, the Hungarian uprising against the communist dictatorship. It was encouraged, the Hungarian people were encouraged to rise up by American radio broadcasts on Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. When they did rise up, there was a terrible Soviet crackdown. The Soviet tanks were in the streets of Budapest, and tens of thousands of Hungarians began fleeing over the borders into Austria and into Yugoslavia. President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower was then the president, proposed that 65,000 of these Hungarian displaced people be allowed to come to the United States as refugees and resettle here. American public was bitterly opposed. 1979, polls showed that a majority of Americans did not want to increase the number of refugees from the new dictatorships in Vietnam and Cambodia who would be admitted to this country. In 1980, Cuban refugees during the Mariel boat lift ran into a wall of American hostility. So did desperate Haitian boat people when they tried to come to this country to flee in flight from terrible suffering and persecution and violence in their home country in 1994. There's always opposition to accepting more refugees. And yet, we still have this tradition of admitting them. Since 1948, some 4 million refugees and asylum seekers have come to the United States. And the point is that once they're here, we're glad they're here. When we look back at the wave of refugees that came in the past, we take pride in the fact that our country made a home for them, that we provided safe haven for people who needed it. After the politics die down, and after the rabble-rousers, the populists, and the xenophobes have moved on to some other issue, Americans incorporate the latest wave of refugees into our own collective self-image as a haven for the oppressed and for vulnerable migrants fleeing persecution and war around the world. There can't be too many Americans today who are proud of the fact that St. Louis was turned back. There can't be too many Americans today who think it would have been wrong to accept the Vietnamese boat people in 1979 and 1980. There can't be too many people who think that Soviet dissidents should have been kept out of the United States. When we look back at it, we take pride in what we provided, in the acts of humanity that we've carried out. It's hard to remember that sometimes in the midst of the ongoing debate, when the fight and the hostility and the politics get so bitter, especially in a year like this one, when it gets caught up in national campaigns as well. You know, sitting here at a panel with so many members of different religious faiths, I have to tell you, my younger son is Latino. My wife and I adopted him when he was almost 1 year old from Guatemala. His bar mitzvah was celebrated a few weeks ago. And I spoke in our synagogue about my son Micah's Torah portion. The portion from the Bible that week included Leviticus 18, which includes the very famous phrase that everyone knows, perhaps the most famous statement of humanity and ethical injunction in all of human civilization: love your neighbor as yourself. But I pointed out to him that that's not the only such injunction in that very chapter. It also commands love the stranger. And I told Micah that in the Talmud, the ancient Jewish sages pointed out that whereas the Bible, the scriptures say to love thy neighbor, it says it once, in one way or another, according to the Talmud, there are 32 different places where scripture says love the stranger. 32. And of course, the Talmud being what it is, you know, somebody promptly argued and said, no, it's 42. You can't have Jewish rabbis without having something to argue. The point that I wanted to impress on him and to those who were with us and to you as well is that in all of our faith tradition, all of us have a deep importance that we attach, not just to love thy neighbor, which can be hard enough in itself. I don't know what your neighbors are like, but love the stranger is a whole higher order of challenge. And yet that's what we are called upon over and over to do. And the stranger can be a convert. The stranger can be someone from a different race. The stranger can be someone who doesn't speak your language. The stranger can be someone who grew up in a completely different environment. The stranger can be someone whose food and clothing and smell and taste and odors and spices are completely unfamiliar to you. Love the stranger is, I would say, the most remarkable commandment that you can find in the scriptures. And that's why, as far as I'm concerned, admitting refugees isn't a question of right versus left. It's about right versus wrong. I've been a political conservative since I was old enough to know what the word meant, since I was in my teens. My politics, I dare say, are very different from that of at least some of the people sitting here at the table. And my political views have been shaped around what I would consider to be fundamental conservative values. Individual liberty, limited government, free markets, opposition to tyranny, respect for religion, gratitude for America and for its blessings. By my lights, the encouragement of immigration, the welcoming of refugees, is a classic conservative idea. My father immigrated to this country from Czechoslovakia in 1948. I grew up, as I mentioned, in Cleveland, and I grew up in a community where I was surrounded by people who were immigrants, who spoke English with an accent, who were Americans by choice. The more grounded I became in my conservatism, the more convinced I became that an open and welcoming immigration policy is good conservative common sense. I mentioned the Haitian refugee crisis of 1994 a couple of minutes ago. One of my earliest columns at the Boston Globe, I've been at the Globe now, you can see I'm turning white hair. I've been at the Boston Globe since that year, since 1994. And one of my very earliest columns was headlined, "Let the Haitians In." And I wrote a column criticizing the Bill Clinton administration for ordering that these Haitian boat people be prevented from landing on American soil. They were being held at a holding bay in Guantanamo before being forced to leave. And I wrote then what I believe now and will believe 10 years and 20 years from now. Immigrants are the great growth hormone of American history. The vast majority of them, you can always find exceptions. There will always be 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 who will be ingrates, who will become criminals, who will do bad things, just as that's true of native-born American citizens. But the vast majority of immigrants who come to this country repay their adopted homeland with energy and enthusiasm and hard work and new wealth. It's not often that I get introduced and hear a mention of Ray Shammy. I don't know how many of you remember Massachusetts politics from the 1980s. I worked for a candidate, Republican candidate, who ran for the U.S. Senate named Ray Shammy. Ray didn't have a chance. He was running as a Republican. He challenged Ted Kennedy in 1982, and of course he lost. And in 1984, he thought he would be challenging Paul Tsongas. Senator Tsongas dropped left the Senate. It ended up being the race that John Kerry won. But I was very happy I worked for Ray for 2 campaigns. He was a wonderful person, a wonderful, warm person who deeply and genuinely believed in the goodness of this country, was passionate and with gratitude for what this country had made possible for him. He began mopping floors in an automat and rose to become a multi-millionaire. And he wanted others to have the same chance that he had. Ray Shammy, some of you will be able to tell from his last name, was the son of Syrian immigrants. He was a conservative Republican. I was thrilled to work for him. The fact that his family was Syrian, the fact that I'm Jewish, wasn't a bar in the least. This is what America is. This is what America can be. And on this issue, as on so many issues, my political paradigm is Ronald Reagan. Professor Egmont mentioned 1980 and how it was President Reagan who was in the White House when the immigration law was signed. Long before Ronald Reagan ran for office, he was an unabashed supporter of robust immigration. He didn't back away from that position when he was a candidate. He didn't back away from it in the White House. And he even referred to it in his final speech to the country, his farewell address before leaving the presidency. In that very last televised address as president, he invoked his favorite metaphor for America, the shining city on a hill. And he said that he had always envisioned America as a place, these are his words, with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity, whose doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. To me, that's America. That's republicanism. That's conservatism. That's America at its best. And it hurts me when I see people who call themselves conservative. And I haven't been a Republican for decades. I unenrolled from any party when I went into the media, but it hurts me to see people who think that there's something Republican or something conservative about being xenophobic. A year or so ago, there was a rally that was held on Beacon Hill. It was at the time that all those young refugees were coming across the border from Guatemala and Honduras. They called it the Take Back Our Country rally, or Stop the Invasion rally, or something like that. And it was led by one of these radio talk hosts. I won't mention any names, but he was whipping up the crowd and telling them how these are all criminals and we have to keep them out, and our country's being invaded, and we have to slam the door shut and all the rest of it. And then he led them in a chorus of God Bless America. I heard that, and I wrote a column about it. The person who wrote God Bless America, his name was Irving Berlin. He was born Irving Berlin. His family came over as refugees from Tsarist Russia, where they were fleeing pogroms, where they were fleeing violence and war and depression. And this Irving Berlin, who later Americanized his name to Irving Berlin, was in love with his new country. And God Bless America was his love hymn to the country that took him in, as it has taken in so many millions of others. And it just hurts in my heart to hear on Boston Common thousands of voices singing God Bless America as though it has anything to do with keeping people out. Ladies and gentlemen, the current crisis over the Syrian refugees, this panic, this freak out, does not represent America at its best. Like those earlier refugees, going back to 1620, refugees from Syria are looking for peace and freedom and a chance for their children to grow up safe. We always gain far more than we risk when we open our hearts, and open our arms, and open our doors. And Americans, whether liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, we must not allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by fear and suspicion, or to let fear and suspicion overwhelm that innately American sense of decency and humanity. To sit on our hands, to refuse to act in the midst of the worst refugee crisis since World War II, the worst by sheer numbers in human history, that should be unthinkable. Americans today are ashamed when they think, those who think about it, are ashamed of the memory of the SS St. Louis and of the willingness of an earlier generation to send desperate refugees to their deaths. How ashamed of us will our children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren be if we fail to show moral integrity now? I'm glad you're all here. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much to our three speakers. And now, if I can open it up to the interfaith panel. There's no, whoever is first, just go ahead and take the mic and make your statement or ask your question.
I have a question down here. I don't think you need a mic to hear me. I like what all three of you have said. It's been very informative and very helpful to us. The question I want to address is to Westy Egmont. And by the way, Westy, hello after decades of us not seeing each other. Dick Trudy.
Dick, holy cow. We're both a little whiter, Dick. Wow, long time.
We have relationships that go way back, but I don't think we've seen each other in 25 years.
Please. Yeah, I'm nice.
So, anyway.
Everybody comes to Hopkinton.
Usually with track shoes, but
you described some great facts about the successes of America in receiving refugees and so forth. And I'm sitting here, and the question that came to me was, why haven't these facts of our success and our generosity in receiving refugees been made more public to the people in general? I think there's a powerful selling point right there. I didn't know any of that until I listened to you.
well, certainly our Globe columnist gave you another whole set in addition to mine. And I think what's unfortunate about us, of course, news feeds on controversy and on the negative, right? The problem. So it's always difficult to come around to the story that's positive and inspiring, and I do think occasionally we see that. Von Abrams was one of my favorite when she was doing immigration, because she so often would give a human face and a positive story. But you're right, we don't have a pulpit for the good news. And maybe it's because the pulpit is occupied by folks who haven't absorbed immigration as part of the gospel or as a part of the Quran or the Torah. But as that happens, something else happens. We can then talk about that in context where those good stories, those inspiring stories, those aspirational stories of a people who have found each other and formed bonds can be told and celebrated. I was doing a piece with World Relief from the evangelical side and Catholic Charities. 50% of all the refugees in the United States are resettled by Catholic Charities. Lutherans are the second largest. And then the U.S. Committee for Immigrants and Refugees, whom I worked for some years. The reality is that these big organizations have media. They tell stories, but it doesn't necessarily find an echo. It doesn't find the repeaters. And that's where all of us can add to our social media, our Facebook pages, just those little feeds of the good thing that you think you found inspiring that tells the story. One of the members of the local mosque here is a friend who owns Dover Rugs, and when we were talking one day, I said, I've got to find a way for you not to just be telling me this. So I invited him onto the Governor's Advisory Council under Governor Patrick, and he was a great voice. Actually, Governor Romney, we started doing that together. But part of it is to find the new voice that isn't being heard and give it platform, give it authority, give it credibility, and allow us all to prosper because we now have been informed from an authentic viewpoint as to what's working. That's at least one response to it.
I'm Phil Poole, and I was glad to hear Jeff talk about strangers. Biblically, because my whole ministry is based on reaching out to strangers, mostly university students.
Who can be very strange.
Yeah. I don't think we're on the strangers, right? But having worked with a lot of different cultures and actually grown up outside of America in my early years in the Middle East, I know socially and culturally there are a lot of differences, especially, for instance, Asian leaders look different than American leaders. And we met on a route refugee actually in Worcester from friends of ours who've been ministry in Jordan, did the Bedouins medically for a lot of years. We connected with him. And he's a doctor because his father wanted him to be a doctor. He was a Christian, but he really would like to be a pastor. So I was wondering, early on when refugees come, what mechanisms are there really to embrace the skills that they have and try to both understand their cultural differences and society differences and how to best utilize and make them
That's a whole chapter of the American experience, isn't it? I'm not a resettlement expert by any means, and we have resettlement experts sitting here at the table. I would step back and take the broader view, which is that every wave that comes here finds things about American life and American expectations and American norms that are different, that are unusual, that are hard to get used to. And the native population living here finds much about every new wave that comes in unfamiliar or different. I love sometimes to compare, I've spoken to audiences about opposition to immigration over the years, and I compare Pat Buchanan, for example, or I guess I could take examples from Donald Trump, talking about immigrants coming over the Mexican border with almost exactly the same kinds of language that Benjamin Franklin used to talk about German immigrants pouring over the Pennsylvania border. They could never expect to assimilate into America's chromatic look. He talks about how they had no interest in getting used to our culture, and they were going to Germanize us before we would ever be able to Anglicize them. If you take out the references to Germany and replace them with Mexican or Hispanic or now Arab or Syrian or Muslim, you'll think that it's exactly the same thing. The pattern gets repeated over and over and over again. As I was driving in, I was listening to a little bit of Chris Lydon on the radio, and he was making some reference to something, I guess, in Nietzsche, I'm not exactly sure, about how some piece of work that Nietzsche wrote where the devil says, I'll give you the choice, you can live forever, But you have to repeat over and over and over and over again. And it's kind of this Groundhog Day syndrome, whether it's Germans coming to Pennsylvania or Mexicans coming into Texas or Florida. The United States in the 1880s enacted a Chinese exclusion law. You know, prior to the 1920s, with this one great exception of the Chinese, prior to the 1920s, we did pretty much have open borders. Very broadly speaking, if you could get yourself to this country and you weren't excluded because of specific objective reasons, certain communicable diseases, membership in anarchist organizations, by and large, you could stay, become a citizen. The one great exception, and it was a grotesque example of racism, was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1880-something. And it was challenged in court, and it went up to the Supreme Court. And you read the Supreme Court opinion upholding the Chinese Exclusion Act, which said that no Chinese could come to this country. And the Supreme Court, in its opinion, talks about them the way Donald Trump talks about Mexicans and the way Benjamin Franklin was talking about Germans, and saying that they're pouring into the country and they're a threat to our cohesion, and they'll never amalgamate. And Congress knew what it was doing when it barred them. It never ends, except that for each group, it does eventually end. And the job for those of us who are here, I would say, is just to get us over the hump quicker rather than slower, to make the transformation and to make the assimilation process, the Americanization process, and the integration process as easy as it can be, and not take a back seat to the people who want to make it as difficult as it can be. It's not a specific answer to specific techniques, except to say every group goes through it, and let's recognize that they've gone through it successfully in the past. They'll go through it successfully in the present. They'll go through it successfully in the future. Let's not make it difficult. Let's make it as easy as we can.
Could I also add, just from more of the programmatic side, to answer your question, with every wave and every new population that comes to the country, without generalizing or stereotyping, there are specific sets of skills or interests that they bring with them. And we've always been quite adept at matching those skills with an industry or need that we have in our economy. We're seeing an enormous shift in the skills that are that we're seeing arrive on our shores. We have highly skilled people. This is one of the points that sometimes is missed, this nuance about the skills that people bring. It's often, refugees are often portrayed as people who bring nothing but the clothes on their backs, and they do nothing but take from the resources of our community, when the truth is we have extraordinarily talented, highly skilled, experienced professional people who come, they just happen to be refugees, and they have credentials that if we could figure out the system and speed up the current system for translating those credentials into marketable skills, we would make an impact on the shortage of medical professionals in this country. We have doctors and psychiatrists and dentists and nurses who come to our shores every day and cannot work in their field. So we have a challenge to improve the process by which we can translate and perhaps upgrade a degree of those and make equitable those